Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1981, and today we're going to talk about the honorable mentions of 1981. We will start with Dungeons & Dragons. In 1981, TSR and Dave Arneson were able to reach a settlement regarding the royalties to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which had been the subject of a lawsuit since 1979. Under this agreement, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson would be listed as co-creators on all Advanced Dungeons & Dragons products, and Dave Arneson would receive a 2.5% royalty on all AD&D products. TSR published the second version of the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons in 1981. This revision, written by Tom Moldvay, was designed to be easier for novice players than the original basic set. Also in 1981, TSR published the expert set of Dungeons & Dragons, written by David Zeb Cook. The expert set was designed for players of the basic set who had characters that went past the early levels. In the world of computers, Tandy discontinued the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1 in 1981. Originally released in 1977, the TRS-80 Model 1 helped revolutionize the home computer market. Of the video games we have talked about, the TRS-80 Model 1 could play Colossal Cave Adventure, Olympic Decathlon, Pong, Rogue, Temple of Apshai, and Zork. Sinclair discontinued the Sinclair ZX80 in 1981. Released in 1980, the ZX80 sold around 50,000 units, helping make UK computer ownership among the highest in the world. Sinclair released the ZX81 on March 5, 1981, as a successor to the ZX80. The ZX81 is another low-cost computer in the UK market. Starting at around £50, around $270 in 2021, the ZX81 uses a Zilog Z80A microprocessor with 1 kilobyte of RAM and room for 64 kilobytes of RAM. The ZX81 proved very successful, warranting a North American release by Timex. Critics at the time saw the ZX81 as a capable introductory computer, and the ZX81 would sell remarkably well. On April 3, 1981, the Osborne Computer Corporation released the Osborne 1. The Osborne 1 is the first portable computer, weighing 24.5 pounds. It ran on a Zilog Z80 microprocessor with 64 kilobytes of RAM. Selling for $1,795, over $5,200 in 2021, the Osborne 1 came with a software package of basic interpreters and an operating system that is estimated to be worth $1,500 at the time of release. The Osborne 1 received mixed reviews from critics, and what sales it was able to make were primarily to businesses. On August 12, 1981, IBM released the IBM 5150. IBM had to this point primarily released business computers. The home computer market was rapidly expanding though, and IBM wanted to create their own personal computer, but were behind technologically. Atari offered to manufacture the parts for an IBM computer, but IBM rejected the offer. IBM considered acquiring Atari for a time to bridge this gap, but that was rejected in favor of a new department at IBM to create its own computer. IBM would use their 8088 microprocessor for their personal computer, which was more powerful than the other home computer processors at the time. The computer would also have either 16 kilobytes of RAM or 64 kilobytes of RAM, with room to expand to 256 kilobytes of RAM. The IBM Personal Computer, or IBM PC, would utilize color graphics, would license Microsoft Basic, and would have an open architecture that allowed and even encouraged third-party companies to create software and hardware that would work with the computer. Microsoft had been hired to create the operating system for the IBM PC. Microsoft wanted to use a disk operating system, or DOS, for the PC. Seattle Computer Products, led by Tim Patterson, had already created QDOS, short for Quick and Dirty Operating System, for a computer kit they sold for the Intel 8086 microprocessor, based on previous operating systems for IBM microprocessors. Seattle Computer Products began licensing QDOS as 86DOS in 1980, short for 8086 Disk Operating System. Since the Intel 8088 being used for the IBM PC was a variant of the 8086, Microsoft put a plan together to convert 86DOS for the Intel 8088. In 1981, Microsoft purchased a license for 86DOS for $25,000, over $72,000 in 2021, and hired Tim Patterson to make the conversion. Just a month before IBM PC's release, Microsoft bought all rights to 86DOS for $50,000, over $145,000 in 2021, from Seattle Computer Products. Microsoft then licensed 86DOS to IBM, who named it PC-DOS 1.0. Microsoft, however, retained the rights to sell the operating system to other companies. After a 12-month development, the IBM 5150 was ready for release, with the cheapest model retailing at $1,595, over $4,600 in 2021. IBM would license Charlie Chaplin's Tramp character in a series of television ads to promote the computer. IBM would release the computer through existing retail stores. In particular, IBM would partner with Computerland and Sears Roebuck and their stores for the PC's release. The IBM PC would prove to be very successful, shattering all expectations. It is estimated that over the course of the next couple years, IBM would sell billions of dollars worth of IBM PCs, at one point selling 40,000 units in a single month. Support from third-party companies was also very high. After a year on the market, one publication counted 753 different software packages available for the IBM PC. With the release of the IBM 5150, the home computer market was changed forever. Seattle Computer Products would later sue Microsoft, claiming that when 86DOS's rights were sold, Microsoft did not fully disclose their relationship with IBM. This lawsuit resulted in a $1 million settlement in Seattle Computer Products' favor. In 1981, Commodore released the Commodore VIC-20 in the United States. Originally released in Japan in 1980 as the VIC-1001, the Commodore VIC-20 used the MOS Technology 6502 processor, the same processor as the Commodore PET, which was released 3 years earlier. It was designed to be a low-cost computer for the emerging home computer market, selling for just $299, around $870 in 2021. The VIC-20 would become the first computer to sell over 1 million units. In August 1981, NEC released a modified 32 kilobyte version of the Japanese PC-8001 in the United States, now named the PC-8001A. It sold for $1,295, over $3,700 in 2021. In November 1981, NEC released the PC-8801 in Japan. The PC-8801 was the successor to the PC-8001 NEC had released in Japan in 1979. The PC-8801 used the NEC MU-PD780 microprocessor, which is comparable to its predecessor and comparable to the Zilog Z80 microprocessor. However, the PC-8801 had 64 kilobytes of RAM compared to just 16 kilobytes in the PC-8001. This allowed the PC-8801 to use Office software as well as a lot more video games. On November 9th, 1981, Apple reintroduced the Apple III computer after its disastrous first release. Despite fixing many of the issues inherent in the original computers, the damage to the Apple III's reputation had been done, and the computer continued to not sell well. In total, the Apple III would only sell between 65,000 and 75,000 units. Let's turn to video games. In February 1981, Midway released Gorf to arcades. Designed by Jamie Fenton, Gorf, short for Galactic Orbiting Robot Force, is a fixed shooter that took heavy inspiration from both Space Invaders and Galaxian. In February 1981, Namco released New Rally X to arcades. New Rally X is an upgrade to the original Rally X, improving the graphics, the sound, and providing easier gameplay. While New Rally X proved to be more successful in Japan than its predecessor, the game was only distributed as an upgrade conversion kit to the original Rally X cabinet in North America. As a result, it did not prove very successful in North America. In 1981, Taito released Space Dungeon to arcades. Designed by Rex Badenberg, Space Dungeon is a twin-stick shooter in which the player explores the dungeon while shooting enemies and collecting treasure. In 1981, APX released Caverns of Mars to Atari home computers. Designed by Greg Christensen and Richard Watts, Caverns of Mars is a vertically scrolling adaptation of Scramble, which added checkpoints so that the player could explore further into the game. In 1981, Online Systems released Cranston Manor to the Apple II. Designed by Larry Ledden, Harold DeWitt, and Ken Williams, Cranston Manor was marketed as High-Res Adventure No. 3. In the game, the player must go into Cranston Manor and grab all 16 treasures inside. In 1981, Online Systems released Ulysses and the Golden Fleece to the Apple II. Designed by Bob Davis and Ken Williams, Ulysses and the Golden Fleece was marketed as High-Res Adventure No. 4. Inspired by Roman mythology, the player plays as Ulysses in a quest to obtain the Golden Fleece. In July 1981, Toza, a Japanese video game company, released Vanguard to arcades in Japan. Vanguard is a multi-directional scrolling shooter in which the player controls the ship and can fire in 4 different directions. The game would be released in North America in October 1981, published by Century. On October 18, 1981, Sega released Turbo to arcades. Designed by Steve Hanawa, Turbo is a racing game in which the player must pass 30 other cars and stay ahead of them when time expires. It was reviewed well, with critics praising the graphics and the realistic arcade cabinet style. In December 1981, Midway released Kick to arcades. This unsuccessful arcade game is notable for having Pac-Man characters in it, occasionally replacing the balloons that the player needs to keep off the ground. Several games that we have played previously received ports in 1981. In 1981, Space Invaders was ported to the Bally Astrocade. Space Invaders had already seen ports to the Atari VCS as well as Atari home computers, but this was the first port to a non-Atari home console. In 1981, Asteroids was ported to the Atari VCS and to Atari computers. The programmers for the VCS port, Brad Stewart and Bob Smith, could not fit Asteroids onto the 4KB cartridge. As a result, the game needed to use bank switching in order to get the game to play on an 8KB cartridge. This was the first game for the Atari VCS to use this technique. The Atari VCS port of Asteroids would sell 3.8 million copies. In 1981, Missile Command was ported to the Atari VCS by Rob Fulop. In the port, the manual labels the defending planet as Zardon and the attackers as Krytal. Rob Fulop also added an Easter egg. If the player uses all their missiles on level 13 without scoring any points, the initials RF will appear on the screen. The Atari VCS port of Missile Command would sell 2.5 million copies. In 1981, Galaxian was ported to the Bally Astrocade. This port was received well by critics for its gameplay, although the graphics were seen as a drawback. In 1981, Zork was released for the Apple II. Although the text style in the game is slightly different, the game ultimately remains the same as previous versions. But Zork was now available on a much more popular computer than it had been previously. Those were the notable ports in 1981. In December 1981, Buckner and Garcia, an American musical duo, released Pac-Man Fever, a music single about Pac-Man. The song reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts in March 1982. By the end of 1982, the single sold 1.2 million copies. The single was part of a full album about video games, but that album was released in 1982, so we will return to that later. In October 1981, Electronic Games Magazine was published for the first time. Video Magazine had been publishing a column named Arcade Alley since 1979, which was the first column dedicated to video games. Electronic Games, though, marked the first magazine devoted entirely to video games. Let's turn to the consoles of 1981. In 1981, Atari published a total of 4 more games for the Atari VCS. Meanwhile, third-party companies published 13 more games for the Atari VCS. This brings the game total for the console to at least 62 games. Behind the scenes at Atari, 1981 marks the year in which Alan Alcorn left the company. With Alcorn's departure, no person responsible for the creation of Pong, the game that brought Atari to the top of the industry, remained at the company. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 added 9 more games to its library in 1981, bringing its total to 36 games. The Bally Astrocade added 11 more games to its library in 1981, bringing its total to 24 games. The 2 ports for the Astrocade we mentioned this year would also have their names changed. Galaxian would become Galactic Invasion, while Space Invaders would become Astro Battle. The Microvision would only add 1 more game in 1981, the final game for the Microvision. Milton Bradley would discontinue the console in 1981. It only had 12 official games. The Intellivision would see 9 new releases in 1981. That brings its total to 28 games. Mattel would also release the keyboard component in 1981. This would explode sales for the console. In 1981, the Intellivision sold over 1 million units, over 5 times what it sold in 1980. In 1981, Nintendo released 10 more games in the Game & Watch series, bringing the total to 15 games. Of the 10 new games in 1981, 3 would sell over 1 million copies. 6 more first-generation consoles would also be released in 1981, all of them in Europe. The number continues to decline, but the dedicated consoles continue to be released in the 80s. The video game industry as a whole continues to be on the rise. In 1981, the United States arcade video game market generated $4.8 billion, almost $14 billion in 2021. The United States home video game market is still behind, but is still growing. It generated $1 billion in 1981, just under $3 billion in 2021. That will do it for the honorable mentions of 1981. My name is Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we look back at 1981 as a whole.